This one haunts me. Good people killed by these bad choices. Let's find out what the choices were and how we can avoid making the same catastrophic choices on this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. This one is very difficult and is a crash that hits close to home for me. I debated doing this report based on the NTSB final and the docket, but there are some things here that are so important for us to take away, whether you're a pilot or not. And the more I read about this crash, the more emotional I got. Incredibly sad, but yet angry, very angry. And you'll see why in a minute. While I did not personally know the victims, they were fellow North Texas aviators, and they crashed at the airport that I trained for my private in a plane similar to the plane I own. But the craziest thing and why this crash haunts me, I'm going to talk about near the end. Finally, I've got a huge announcement about the channel at the end of this video, so please stick around. A quick summary of what happened. On December 4th, 2022, at almost 11 p.m., a Cessna 205 crashed after takeoff from Cleburne, Texas, on their way to Granbury, only 26 miles away. In instrument conditions, they were in the clouds, on an IFR plan, killing both people instantly. And both pilots were very experienced. Let's go over how that could have happened and what bad choices could lead to such devastating consequences. Let's start with the airplane. It's called a Cessna 210-5. The 210 is a Centurion, which is what I fly. Mine was delivered in 1980. The accident one was in 1962. The 210 was created as a six-seater, single-piston engine. Originally based off the Cessna 182, it was made bigger and added retractable landing gear. The early models kept the wing struts, and later designs removed the struts. But in 1962, Cessna, working on a new model that kept the gear fixed, it wasn't retractable, Cessna officially designated it the 210-5. But this new design, some called the Super Skywagon, was really the first design of the Cessna 206 Stationair, which is still made today, a six-seater with fixed gear. The 210-5 or 205 came with an IO 470, producing 260 horsepower. But the accident airplane had been upgraded to the IO 550, used in many planes, including the Cirrus SR-22s, the Barons and Bonanzas. And although some reports have the plane with the IO 470, this one had the Texas Skyways conversion to the 550 way back in 2001. An interesting note, at the time it was sold, late 2020, 2 years before the accident, the engine had only 308 hours. For 20 years, the plane had not been flown much. And for avionics, at the time the plane was sold, about 2 years before the accident flight, the plane had a Garmin GNS 530 GPS Navcom with the old Century 2B autopilot. The interior had been redone in 2020. In front of the left seat pilot was a standard analog six-pack. They had VORs with an ILS. And there was a 3M WX-10A storm scope, which, as I understand it, displays thunderstorm activity mainly due to lightning discharges. It's not precip based, as the case with my old style weather radar that I have on my 210. There was no backup attitude indicator. It's unknown whether the avionics had been upgraded during the time it was purchased to the final flight. But that's the plane and most likely the avionics the pilots had to work with. Bottom line, the avionics were pretty rudimentary if they hadn't been upgraded in the last 2 years before the accident. Okay, the pilots. There's a husband and wife, somewhat newly married. Both of them were highly qualified and well-liked in the community. And by all reports, both were accomplished and skilled pilots. As Mark Patey recently told me in an interview on our In the Hangar channel, everyone who's ever crashed probably thought or said, well, that'll never happen to me. In the left seat was the husband. The NTSB lists him as the pilot, but they also say that they can't verify who was the actual pilot flying for the accident flight. But the husband was in the left seat, and he was the one who filed as the pilot in command, the PIC. And the wife had cold medicine in her system and was sitting in the right seat. By all probable evidence, the husband was at the controls. 35 years old, commercial pilot, flight instructor, including instrument, and instrument helicopter as well. He had 860 total hours, all aircraft. He had a second-class medical exam about 3 years prior, so it would have reverted to a third class at the time of the accident. I want to reiterate, he was an instrument instructor, but according to the NTSB, he had 2.8 hours of actual instrument flying and 26.9 hours of night flying since 2016. And for non-pilots, let me explain. IFR stands for Instrument Flight Rules. You need this certificate to fly by instruments as opposed to flying visually. IMC means Instrument Meteorological Conditions. In other words, flying in clouds or conditions that you have to rely on the instruments for attitude and course. And I've gone through every page in his logbook from the docket. It only goes back to October of 2016, so his initial flight training is not shown in the docket. What the NTSB has is probably his second logbook, and they don't have the first one. A couple of things stand out. First, the husband sounds like a great guy, someone that would be a good friend. I'm surprised at the lack of night and actual IMC flying the past 6 years. I went back into my logbook to see what my actual IMC and simulated IMC was at 860 hours. I had 127 hours of actual and 34 hours of simulated. You rack up those kind of actual hours by flying long cross countries, and you rack up the simulated doing training to keep current. In the previous 6 months, the husband did have 27 hours of cross-country logged, but most of those were short, 1 hour or so trips. He had 5 hours of night flying in that same time period, the last 6 months. And over half of the 5 hours was the week before the accident flight, the trip out. He had 2 night landings logged in the last 90 days, and you need 3 to maintain currency to carry passengers in the previous 90 days. For the probable cause of spatial disorientation, the lack of night flying is an important piece of the puzzle. And I've read some comments from relatives about how careful and almost OCD he was in his approach to flying. While this is not causal to the crash, it does speak to the mindset and approach to flying. But what is causal to spatial disorientation is the lack of experience and currency on night flying, IMC flying, cross-country trips. Again, he sounded like a great guy, and my heart breaks for his family. By his logbook, he should have gotten more training for this type of flight. But that's not the most shocking evidence from his logbook. To fly by instrument flight rules, the FAA requires the pilot to have an IFR certification. The husband had that. In fact, he had his instrument instructor certificate. So he taught all of this. But the FAA also requires a pilot who flies by IFR to fly 6 approaches, holding procedures, and tracking of courses within the preceding 6 months. You can do these in actual conditions or simulated using a view-limiting device. And after the 6 months, you aren't considered current, but you still then have 6 more months to fly those 6 approaches with a safety pilot to have your currency reinstated. After those 12 months, you will have to get with an instrument instructor and have an instrument proficiency check, or IPC, where the certified flight instructor instrument signs you off. The FAA regulations do not give a number of approaches, holds, or course tracking, but just that the IPC must include the areas of operation contained in the ACS, the testing standards for the rating held. 2.5 weeks before the accident flight, the husband did go up with an instructor and recorded 1.8 hours with 1.4 hours of simulated instrument and 2 approaches and a hold with what looks like an IPC. And then you have to go back 18 months before you see another approach for the husband. Faced with a lack of proficiency, fatigue, a sick wife, night flying, and deteriorating weather, a hotel in Cleveland would have been a great idea. And there's a huge takeaway here that I want to talk about, the 3-strike rule, but I'll save that for the end. Okay, more about the husband. Originally from the East Coast, he moved to North Texas to take a job instructing at a flight school, working towards accumulating his hours to reach the airline transport pilot certification, which is 1,500 hours. It was during this time that he met another instructor pilot, the young woman who would become his wife. The two got married, and she was in the right seat on that accident flight. An even more accomplished pilot. There has been much made on social media about the wife being so experienced that she should have never let this happen. But the evidence paints a different picture of what was going on in the cockpit that night. According to the IFR flight plan, as I mentioned before, the husband was the pilot in command. In the autopsy, the wife had cold medicine in her system. She was a passenger. Some say she should have spoken up. But how do we know that she wasn't curled up in her seat nursing that cold or even asleep? As a matter of fact, the husband was found in the 4-point restraints, but the wife didn't even have her seatbelt on. And I mentioned the wife was far more experienced of a pilot. She had her ATP certification over 2,300 hours and had most recently been working professionally for a Part 135 operator flying a small jet. She had 72 hours of night flying and 14.8 hours of actual instrument. Again, it's pretty low for actual instrument for an IFR-rated pilot with 2,300 hours. However, she had not logged any flights in a small plane under 12,500 pounds in over 6 months. She had been flying an Embraer Phenom 300 for the Part 135 operator. And one last note about the couple's mindset. I flew through that area that night. It's part of what haunts me, and I'll get to that in a minute. It was solid IMC, and I was in it for some time, coming from the same direction as this couple. Their previous leg from a fuel stop in Arkansas to the short stop in Cleburne was not performed under an IFR flight plan, which means they were flying visual flight rules while in IMC conditions for the approach into Cleburne. Again, not causal to the crash, but indicative of the mindset. Look, people that knew these two beautiful souls speak to how careful they were as pilots, how professional they were. It's an incredibly important message for us left behind that we need to be vigilant. I need to be vigilant, knowing that it can't happen to me is a falsehood, that it can happen to me, and I need to account for that in my planning and in my judgment. Okay, they took off from Fairmont Municipal Airport in West Virginia around 10 a.m. The couple had flown for 8.5 hours, stopping twice for fuel, and the last stop was Cleburne, Texas, 21 miles away from Granbury, their final destination. They landed at Cleburne in the dark at 8:22 p.m. They called the owner of the plane to let them know they were topping off in case they had to do a missed approach with the weather getting bad. It was after dark, almost 9 p.m. The weather at Cleburne was overcast at 300 feet above the ground and visibility of 2.5 miles. Winds were 150 at 6 knots. The sun had set 2 hours before the crash. It was dark. The husband filed an IFR flight plan. The two got back on board. Cleburne is a small unattended airport, but they have several crew cars that pilots can use if they need to go into town for food or a hotel. And I know because I've used those cars. Before takeoff, the husband got his clearance from ATC and was assigned a heading of 090 initially and a climb to an altitude of 3,000 feet. The airplane took off from runway 15 and no further communications were ever received. According to ADSB data, the airplane took off to the south and then turned right, which was the opposite direction given by ATC, and it took them west towards their destination of Granbury, and after turning roughly 90 degrees, it made a rapid descending right turn about 500 feet above the ground. And the airplane continued to descend until crashing into a vacant construction site, coming to rest about 80 feet from the initial impact point. A post-impact fire consumed the wreckage. The NTSB investigation showed no evidence of mechanical failure or instrument failure. And nearby surveillance video captured audio of the airplane's departure, and no abnormal engine sounds were heard. A witness about 300 yards southeast of the accident site told the NTSB that it appeared to be at a low altitude, the right-hand bank at the high rate of speed just before impact. After the sound of the engine at full power of the impact, the night turned silent again, and 2 people were gone in seconds. The NTSB determined the probable cause of the crash to be an in-flight loss of control as a result of spatial disorientation in night IMC. It said that if God meant man to fly, he had given him wings. And while we've proven that adage wrong, one truthful part of that statement is that people are not built to maintain directional stability in 3-dimensional space with no visual reference. And our ears are some amazing instruments that give us balance. Each person has 2 sets of these biological gyros. The problem is those instruments are easily fooled when sight reference is taken away. In 3-dimensional space, where you can go up, down, left, right, forward, backward, without visual reference, going forward can feel like you're actually going up. You might feel you're turning left when you're actually level. We've done a whole video on this subject, and I'll include a link to it below. But if you rarely fly by instruments, instead flying all the time visually, you might not transition to the instruments, or you trust your feelings more than the instruments, what you feel. And I've seen this in helicopter pilots especially, who do most of their flying low altitude and looking outside, rarely looking at their instruments. We did a video for a large helicopter manufacturer in their helicopter sim, taking 4 different very experienced helicopter pilots and throwing them into inadvertent IMC, and each one crashed in less than a minute. So what can a pilot do? Well, first step is to be current, and the second step is to be proficient. Flying in hard IMC at night requires training and skill. Make sure you have both. And with this crash happening in North Texas where I live, I heard about it pretty quickly. Social media was ablaze with the news, and many friends knew these 2 beautiful people. And many pilots here were trained by them. They flew with them, were friends with them. And what haunts me the most, I flew almost the exact same route about 2 hours ahead of them on December 4th, 2022 in my 210. I had a TV shoot in Kentucky and had 2 of my crew with me. Our destination was the same, Granbury, where one of my crew lived. After our fuel stop in Arkansas, I saw the weather was covering North Texas. I filed an IFR flight plan. Being just after the sun had set, coming into Granbury, we broke out at about 900 feet above the ground, about 200 feet above the minimums. But it was going to get worse over the next few hours, down to 300 feet by the time the married couple took off from runway 15 in Cleburne. And by then, my plane was safely parked in the hangar. And when I heard the news about the Cleburne crash that night, I didn't know the 2 people. Our paths had not really crossed, but the degree of separation was maybe 1. Many of my friends knew them. So this crash haunted me, and I found myself thinking about it as the months went by. And even after the NTSB came out with the final report, I read the summary really quick, and I actually tried to put it out of my mind. It was too close to home, but I kept returning to it. And then I started reading the docket and the logbooks and the interviews, and I actually got angry. These 2 good people, it's not like they made one bad call and paid the ultimate price. These 2 beautiful souls made a series of bad calls, bad choices that get good people killed. And again, I'll mention Mark Patey and his brother Mike Patey. They talk about a 3-strike rule, and I've started doing it as well. I'm actually working on a document that when I'm done, I'll share with you all. But the principle is basically this. When faced with questionable situations, call them strikes. And when you get to 3, you're out. You pull out your credit card and you take a break. You don't go flying. Now, this doesn't mean things that are clearly outs, like the plane wouldn't even start. Well, that wouldn't be a strike, it would be an out. Or if you had a drink a few hours before, that's an out, that's not a strike. A strike is maybe flying at night. Another strike may be a little fatigue. A long day of already flying. Another strike might be your passenger being sick and taking cold medicine. or lack of experience, or proficiency in IMC, or at night. Outs, not strikes, would be not being current in night flying, not being instrument certified. But you can use this for a lot of other things in life beyond aviation. Maybe you're going on a long trip by car. What are some strikes you might have there? What about a difficult work situation, a career choice, or a relationship you're trying to navigate? A 3-strike rule can save you a lot of heartache, and that's my takeaway from this tragedy. Okay, special channel announcement. Back at the beginning of the year, we leaned into aviation news here, and we moved all the aviation lifestyle interviews and Fly With Me videos to a new channel called In the Hangar. I love news. I'm a news junkie. In my TV career, I'm built for producing news. In news, there are actually ethics and best practices. I know many organizations have seemed to have forgotten that. But I've been questioned by another YouTuber, Captain Joe, on reporting names, which has made me think. I've done a ton of journalism research studying best practices, and it is well within the boundaries of good journalism, ethical journalism, to report names of individuals involved in newsworthy stories. So I prayed about it, and I talked to some people I respect, like Mark Patey, Josh and Chelsea from Aviation 101, Gavin, Nick, you guys know who you are, and other mentors. Mark stipulated that it is within journalistic ethics to report the names, but he advised me to err on the side of empathy for those left behind on these tragic stories. And after praying and soul searching, this is where I've decided to land going forward for this channel. There will be times I will report names, like when the identities are so public that it would be a distraction to not mention, like the recent case of Netflix star Matt Wright, or the crash of songwriter Brett James, or the crash of NFL star Russ Francis and AOPA Vice President Richard McSpadden. But in today's story, I could have reported the names of the husband and the wife. It's all over the news, and it's out there. It's not a secret. But I agree with Mark, and I don't want to cause any further heartache for the family and friends. I just want to report on a story that has huge takeaways that can save lives in the future with as much accuracy as possible. You see, since reporting on these stories, I've become a much improved pilot, night and day difference in my aeronautical decision making. And that's the whole point. Reporting these stories can make us better and safer pilots, and hopefully save some lives. So moving forward, this channel's journalistic philosophy will be to report the news truthfully and as accurately as possible, but err on the side of empathy in reporting names of people who have died. Now, as far as thumbnails, in YouTube, I used to think that great content, great reporting will find an audience, but today it's simply not true. If you don't have a thumbnail that grabs attention, your video just will not be watched. Some might accuse us of clickbait in our thumbnails, but let's define the word clickbait. And I define it as an image or title that does not deliver what the content of the video has. So using images and enticing words are not clickbait if you deliver what you're showing in the thumbnail inside the body of the video, and that will be our practice. I know some of you might disagree, but I just want to be honest and transparent with you. Feel free to voice your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. I do read most of them, and some of your comments have changed my mind at times and taught me to be a better pilot and a better person. And thanks for being a part of this channel's growth and our recent passing of 200,000 subscribers. And I want to thank our sponsors like 67 Designs. They make mounts for your phone, your cameras, for vehicles, for boats, and for airplanes. They're made in America, not just outsourced with a label slapped on them. They're built to last, and they're creating jobs here. 67D.com. And Marshall Protective Services, mpsprotects.com, personal protection elevated. And if you'd like to see another one of our reports, you can check it out right here. Thanks again for being a part of this channel. Remember, superior judgment trumps superior skills. Take care, stay safe.